But let's start taking some questions because this is one of my favorite parts is really the interaction with all of you. And we've got a question here from Karina. Can you see that in the Zoom chat, Lynn? Can you tell us how we can deal with stage fright? It's such a
Yeah,
great question.
it is. And it's such a common problem amongst performers, even performers who are very experienced. So there's a couple of things that you've got to understand with stage fright. One is that it's based, the reason why we get the physical reaction like shaking, sweating, feeling nauseous, all of this is because our body has gone into a stage called fight or flight. And there's also freeze as well, which has been explained through the polyvagal theory. So by the time we get to this place where we've actually got these symptoms, it's kind of too late. So the idea is that actually we need to start before that. So if we wind back and say, well, what started my stage fright? And if it's something like believing that you aren't good enough, that you're going to be judged, that being visible is dangerous, that you're not capable, that what you want isn't isn't available to you, that being exposed is frightening, that you might get hurt. If these kind of beliefs are starting to kick in, then actually, if we get rid of the beliefs that lead up to the actual fight or flight stage, then we can get rid of stage fright very quickly. So for me, it's about getting rid of the actual beliefs that are triggering the fight or flight response that our body's gone into. So maybe exploring, first of all, what is the thought what are the thoughts that are going on in your head as you think about performing or singing in front of other people. So maybe Karina, have you identified what those thoughts are? And then while you think about that, I will also go on to this other questions. Are limiting beliefs part of our survival instinct? Tell us when we can or should fight or flight or freeze. Yeah, so limiting beliefs are not, no, because limiting beliefs didn't exist before we started to become sort of aware. Whereas you have that ability to go into fight or flight response right from the moment you exist. When you're born, for certain. Actually, I don't know factually whether you can go into. I think you can go into fight or flight as a baby, because I once heard a story about a guy who regressed, and he had a fear of drums. Like every time he heard drums, he had this incredible fear come up, and he just needed to get away or stop the sounds, anything that sounded like banging. And he couldn't figure out why for the life of him until he regressed and he went back to being in utero. So he was inside his mum's womb, and they grew up in an African country where there was a lot of unrest and there was some kind of civil war, and some people were coming to raid the house, and his mum had gone and hidden herself in a cupboard, and she was obviously very frightened. And what he was hearing, what he realized, was actually her fast heartbeat. And so he'd picked up her fast heartbeat and felt her fear, and then he became frightened. So that actually got carried out into when he, after he was born, and then, as he was growing up. And it wasn't until he identified that through hypnosis and regression that he actually discovered that he, had this fear that when he heard that sound, it was like that moment when his mum was really frightened and in fear of her life. So we have that already ingrained into our DNA. It's a survival instinct that saves us from, danger, from being eaten by predators, etc. So the beliefs are things that we pick up as we go through life, and so they're not really necessarily connected. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
Yeah, I think that's
Karina,
really, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, I think I think that's really important to understand, right? And I share your thoughts on that. Obviously, there's some instinctual reaction, but if we consider that fight or flight mode, a reactionary is more
Mm.
an immediate reaction, right? And I think that discovering your limiting beliefs, especially the ones you don't know you have, sometimes can be
Mhm.
so valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got. You wanted. Karina responded to your question. She's saying there. I'm scared that I might forget the lyrics sometimes or get pitchy when I get nervous.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, when we get nervous and we start to shake and we start to get tension in our throat, we will actually maybe go off pitch. And then the other thing that happens, because your body's gone into this fight or flight, it's sending adrenaline and cortisol out. And the brain is going, well, I can't be doing with thinking about lyrics right now. I've got to run or I've got to fight. And so, of course, we do forget our lyrics. And then it's the memory of that moment that then creates consequent stage fright. So we remember, oh, remember that time when you forgot your lyrics or when you went off pitch. And now every time I go on stage, that's probably going to happen. And so now we build up this belief that it's going to happen again. So we need to wind back again to go, actually, if we just stop the whole process of fight or flight or the polyvagal process theory going into action, then actually we will be very, as my client said, very present in the moment. We'll be able to focus on doing all the things we need to do to stay on pitch, to remember the lyrics, and so on. Of course, if you haven't been practicing, if you haven't been doing the work that you need to do, then that might also be a contributing factor.
And I think it's really important. Important to realize that it's very normal, right? Every performer gets a surge of adrenaline, and that there's this fine line between when it is actually enhancing what you do and
Yeah.
when it becomes too much. And I think that's just important. If you haven't been performing for 30 years, to realize that everybody gets this surge of adrenaline. It's just getting the right balance. I mean, let's say if you drink a little bit of alcohol, you feel great. If you drink a lot, you feel awful, right? So, so it's a bit of that. You can embrace that nervousness in a positive way when you
Mm.
realize this can actually help, right? And there's a lot of just sometimes it can be a comforting thought. You're not alone. Even the greatest singers, some of the greatest singers of all time. There's a
Mm.
story about Jose Carreras, who's one of the most well-known tenors, one of the
Mm.
three tenors that for of our generation, and she was overheard saying backstage, the little me is trying to strangle the big me. The little me is trying to strangle the big me. And then I had a fit and said, get out of the way. The big me wants to sing. And then he went on stage. So realizing it's everybody's dealing with this.
Mm.
And in my personal experience, it really helps if you really helps just the more you're feeling good about yourself and your life. So tying this back into your beliefs, and you are the creator. If you're
Mm.
feeling good about things, you're going to go on stage, and you will be much more able to use that adrenaline. Whereas I've had moments in my life where I was an incredible amount of stress and turmoil, and still had to perform every
Mm.
night, and then in those instances experienced some weird things,
Yeah.
right? And even as a experienced performer. But
Yeah.
some really great stuff, and great questions,
There's
Karina.
another thing about once the adrenaline actually gets out into the system, we can't, pull it back in.
Yeah.
So you've got to use it. So I would highly recommend you run on the spot, do some star jumps just to help the body to disseminate the adrenaline and the cortisol through the body. That's another thing that could help rather than just standing there, and going, oh my God, I'm, feeling nervous. And the body and the brain don't really know very much difference between excitement and and fear. They actually start off in a very similar way. They have very similar reaction. Yeah.
That's great advice. One thing I can just share, maybe this will help some of you, but it helped me a lot when I would get nervous. Just look back. Let's say you've been rehearsing for a show or you've been practicing for your concert for months and weeks, and then for some reason you get this panic moment. Everybody does before you go on stage. So one little inner monologue that helped me quite a bit was just say, how many times has this been absolutely dreadful in the last 6 weeks? Well, my rehearsals, every time I've done this. And the answer was always zero, right? It was never absolutely dreadful. So why should it all of a sudden now, after I've done it for hundreds of times, suddenly fall apart? It's not going to. It's not going to. Just remind yourself, you've got this. I used to visualize, you have this range. Here's like your very top, best performance of your life ever you can imagine. And here's like the worst performance of the last 3 weeks. Well, guess what? They're pretty close together. Right? And you're not going to drop below that level into the abyss. You're going to be somewhere in between that level. That was really comforting to me. I'm like, yeah, you're right, Philippe. You're right. It's not going to be dreadful. And then you just go on, and it worked for me. So maybe that kind of a inner monologue can
Yeah.
help you a little bit.
Self-talk. Yeah, self-talk's good.